DANMCGRATH. I'm the Communications Director for the Minnesota Voters Alliance.
Take it away.
All right. Well, we're really excited about being in court today. We think it went really well. The judge clearly has a good command of the statutory issues. Our fantastic attorney, Eric Ardall, who will be making remarks in a few moments, gave excellent oral arguments today. I think what's really, really important and crucial about this case is that the Secretary of State is a partisan, elected official who presides over his own election. And in a position like that should be the most transparent government official in all of our government. And it is he who is resisting the disclosure of data that should be public to the public so that we can independently verify the veracity, the validity of our elections.
I do have a couple questions. I don't know if you want me to ask them now, if you want me to ask them.
Shoot, go ahead.
Can you explain what information are you looking for and why do you want it?
Well, we're looking for information on voters who have become inactive due to a verification of address problem. So if the Secretary of State tries to verify your address that you provided on your voter registration application and it doesn't check out, they try again. And after that second attempt to verify your address, they'll remove you from the voter rolls. So these are people who maybe have a question about their residence in a precinct, if the address they provided is even real, and that information is being censored from the public information list, so we can't see that. In addition, we're looking for information on other voters who may have been challenged due to ineligibility to vote. That information is also being censored from the public information list, so we're seeking other information that we're entitled to under the Minnesota's Data Practices Act.
Is it fair to say that the Minnesota Voters Alliance does believe that there has been voter fraud in the state of Minnesota?
Well, it's been documented and proven. Over 1,000 cases of just ineligible felons alone after the 2008 election. And the recent report from the legislative auditor has demonstrated that there is a problem with ineligible voting still in Minnesota.
The legislative auditor does say, though, that they can't be sure whether or not these voters were ineligible.
Well, out of 600 some that they looked at, they were only to determine what was the number, 11, 12?
20 may have been eligible.
20 may have been eligible. The majority were found not to have been. So yeah, it's a documented problem, and we're working with this data in an attempt to improve our election system to protect it against fraud and abuses.
So let's say you do get the data, the judge rules in your favor. What are you going to do with it? Could you explain that to me again?
Well, there's a lot of uses for it, but there's something that right now under the Secretary of State's reasoning, no one can even do. If we ask for a list of every person who voted in the 2016 election, the Secretary of State won't provide it. He'll provide us a redacted list to say, well, I'll give you some of the names. So we can't even add the total number of ballots against the total number of people who voted and show that it ticks and ties. That's the most fundamental, basic validation check in an election, and we can't even do it with what the Secretary is offering. That's why we're suing. But that's just one thing that needs to be looked at. We need to look at these ineligible, potentially ineligible people who are flagged for challenge but voted anyway. People whose address didn't check out but voted anyway. This is to verify the validity of our election results.
We're happy to say that we just concluded a hearing in Ramsey County District Court in the Andy Seelick Minnesota Voters Alliance case against Secretary of State Simon. And it was a really good oral argument. The claim is we are entitled to information under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, and the Secretary of State won't give us such basic information as 1.8 million voter records regarding inactive voters, won't give us information about why people are ineligible, their status, why people who are ineligible are voting. All this data is being hidden by the Secretary of State, withheld in violation of the law. Now, I sat there for, we sit there for an hour? Something like that. And I sat through another hearing earlier, and the Secretary of State is acting, well, very un-Minnesotan. I mean, in Minnesota, we share information so we can improve our systems, right?
Right.
So the election laws are a system. We want to have a system where all the eligible people get to vote, but none of the ineligible people get to vote. And the Secretary of State is acting as if there's a problem here, because these arguments that the Secretary of State is making are legally dubious. The Secretary of State is saying the county auditor has some responsibilities. Those statutes mean that I don't have to fulfill my responsibilities in the Data Privacy Act, Data Practices Act, and that's just wrong. So the Secretary of State has made legally dubious arguments to withhold information from the public regarding inactive voters and voter status, like being ineligible. So let's go back to the inactive voters for a moment. So if we're the public and we find out, let's say 2.8 million of our citizens have registered to vote and 1.8 million have not. Well, the public wants to have that information so we can go out and register those people. But the Secretary of State is saying, I can hold those names back and I have the discretion to give them to whomever I want. So let's say there was a partisan Secretary of State. Let's say the partisan Secretary of State had a memory stick, and the memory stick had 1.8 million voter records of inactive voters, and the Secretary of State gave it to a friend, a political ally, and that could be used for registration voter drives. Well, that's wrong. That's not Minnesota. Minnesota is share the information, let's get everyone registered, let's get it done. That's one thing that should be, not contested. Everyone should agree that all the voting records should be available to everyone so we can all register our neighbors, our friends, our relatives. The other part of it is, and this is about confirming past elections, anyone who's lived in Minnesota for a long time knows that these elections can be close. They can be by 1 vote, they can be by 2 votes, they can be by 312 votes in a statewide election, as with Frank and Coleman. What we want is the information the Secretary of State has about ineligible people voting. The Secretary of State is required to investigate that kind of incident, ineligible people voting, but we can't get the information to know that Secretary of State is doing his job. And I think his concern is, if we get the data for past elections, we're going to show that close election after close election after close election was determined by ineligible voters. That finally will undermine the Secretary of State's claim that we have the best election system in the world, because we know we don't. And we're only going to have the best election system in the world if we get this data, and the Minnesota Voters Alliance gets to look at the data, analyze it, and propose reforms.
Do you believe that all these close elections have been decided because of ineligible voters?
Yes, the Coleman-Franken race was decided statewide by 312 votes, and there are hundreds of prosecutions of ineligible felons voting. So the county attorney knew, and how many were there, 700 prosecutions, something like that? There's quite a few, more than 312.
Yeah, it was in that neighborhood.
Yeah,
Well, there were 1,000 cases, and then
they were prosecuted,
a
yeah.
subset that were convicted.
Right.
Do you disagree with the various studies that say there is no such thing as widespread voter fraud? It doesn't exist?
That's called fake news, right? Fake news.
No, that's called the Brennan Center. And David Schultz.
No, the fact is that we have documentation that ineligible people are voting. So the point that the Secretary of State has raised in previous litigation is we can't discourage ineligible people from voting, because that means that fewer eligible people would vote. And we see no evidence of that. That if we're vigorous in ensuring ineligible people don't vote, that improves our elections. It doesn't harm them. And so we strongly believe that stopping ineligible people from voting is part of the election system. And I guess the progressives in Minnesota disagree. They think that, we want everyone to vote. No, we don't want non-citizens who are ineligible to vote. We don't want felons who are not eligible to vote. We don't want wards who are under court orders saying they can't vote to vote. All of those have happened in Minnesota. And a lot of times these elections turn on a few votes, like I mentioned, and that's what we want to avoid, is elections being determined by ineligible voters. And we want to make sure as many people register as possible, and here the Secretary of State is stopping that from happening by treating the list of inactive voters, that is 1.5 million or so, from being publicly distributed. And it should be publicly distributed so all of us can ask our neighbors, relatives, friends to register so they can vote too.
Thanks, Jess. All right, good job, you guys.